Mm-hmm.
All right. Okay, so today I want to talk to you about getting started with Pattern Lab and Drupal 8 using Emulsify. My name is Javier Morquecho, and I'm an IT engineer web application developer for Kaiser Permanente. Now, first off, how many of you have used Pattern Lab or Emulsify before?
Have not.
Okay, so this is a new design system. And one thing that I want to get through this presentation is to just get you up to speed with what's going on. And as of this presentation, there was a new update to Emulsify version. So as of 3 weeks ago, what I'm talking about now is already going to be outdated. So this will bring you up to speed to as of 3 weeks ago. But there is an upgrade path, and I'm currently working on the new version of Emulsify as we speak. So that'll be a topic for a future presentation. So with Pattern Lab, I'm going to first talk to you about what was Drupal 7 theme development like, what is the new way of theming, Drupal 8 theme development. Then, if you're brand new, how to set up your local environment so that you can get started right away without any barriers. You'll need to set up Drupal 8. You'll need to set up Emulsify. And I want to show you some development features that will need to be set up so that you can do debugging, and then how to work with Pattern Lab and some next steps, and some very important resources that I used to develop Emulsify in the previous version as of 3 weeks ago. Now with Drupal 7 theme development, if you look at the Bartik theme, here's just what a generic file structure and folder structure look like. So you have your main structure here on the left, and you'll notice that there's a templates file in the middle and what the CSS file structure looks like. So the reason I'm showing you this file structure is so that you can navigate your way when you do use Emulsify and Pattern Lab, because the folder structure navigation is something that is very important to understand so you know where you're working in. Now, with the templates, you'll notice that with Drupal 7 theme development, the templates are almost in a flat structure. You'll see the comments, maintenance page, the node template file and the page template file all on the same level. Same thing with the CSS. Everything seems to be on the same level. Now, just going through, if you want to see what it looks like when you're developing with Drupal 7, you'll have your style sheet, your style page on the top right, and everything is flat. You're almost developing a style guide for all features or all elements of your page in that one file, and you're just defining it based on how you do your comments. If you look on the top left, that's where you have your template files. And in these template files, you're developing in PHP, and this is kind of the structure that you saw when you're developing with the Drupal 7 site. And at the bottom, you'll have your pre-processed template where you wrote additional functions that modified the theme. Now, the new way of theming, which is becoming very popular and the preferred way to use in front-end development, is using a system of components. So an atomic design and component-based development. So the way that you want to think of developing websites is not necessarily by building pages, but by building components that represent each piece of the page, like a building block of the page. So imagine splitting your web page into every piece of component of the page. And I'll go into this a little bit more detail in the next slide. But we're organizing a website into a system of reusable parts, and those parts are being used on various pages throughout the website.
Javier?
Uh-huh.
Hi, Jeff has a question.
Oh.
Does PHP need to be modified at all?
We're modified in this new component-based development.
Yes, that's correct.
You don't need to modify PHP, but there is a version requirement. As long as you're on the latest version of PHP, it should work. And so that's a great question, but there doesn't have to be any modifications that you need to do outside of just installing the latest version of PHP. And I'll show more about the PHP dependency in the coming slides.
Perfect. Thank you.
Welcome. Now, here is what atomic design is. And whoops, there is a video. I think the video will show in this version. Okay. It's not playing. Oh, it's just loading. Okay. Oh, there it is. Oh, unable to play the video. So this video, what was going to show, I have it here. Okay. So if you can see, this is kind of how it breaks up the pages. As I was saying, each piece is its own component, and it's put together like building blocks or Legos to build the page. So you start with the atoms, which are the lowest level components. You put those together into a combination and it makes molecules, organisms, and then the templates, and then finally the page. And what you're doing is pretty much designing the individual pieces and putting them together. So that was that video. Oh, do you guys still hear me? Because it looks like the connection may have been lost.
I could still hear you.
I'm
Okay.
good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, my connection got disconnected temporarily. So now here's Drupal 8 theme development. So now, if you're looking at that exact same Bartik theme in Drupal 8, what you'll notice on the left-hand side is just that's a generic structure for that theme, but you'll notice everything is written with a different kind of template. The center one is the template folder, and the right one is the CSS folder. So the template is still the same, but if you notice, it's kind of broken out into a little bit more components. You still see the page HTML twig, node HTML twig, but the main difference is that instead of using a .tpl template file, you're using twig, which is just another templating system for PHP. So what is different is just the syntax is a little bit different. And on the right-hand side, you'll notice the CSS is still a flat structure. So now you do have a base folder and a components folder, and if you were to go into it, it would still be almost a flat structure where you're developing your CSS in that one page. And in the CSS page itself, that's where you're dividing out the different sections of what builds up the page. Now, just to show you what does a Drupal 8 theme page look like and comparing it to the Drupal 7, on the top left, now you have your twig template files. And the only thing that's different is that now you're using twig as your templating system, but that's important for later. And then on the top right, CSS is still the same. And then on the bottom, your pre-process is now, instead of a template.php, it's a bartik.theme file. So that's a difference. But now, just letting you know that you will be using Twig for Drupal 8, and it's another template engine for PHP. Now, for someone who wants to get started immediately and wants to set this up on their computer, the first thing is to set up your local development environment. And I'm going to show you the most basic implementation so that you can do this on your computer at home without much need to install extra functionality that may not work in some instances. Now, for example, you'll need your code editor. Visual Studio Code is good because it's free and it works very well. There's other code editors you could use, but this is one. The next one If you're on a PC, you'll need your PowerShell for your terminal command line interface. And if you're on a Mac, you can use their built-in terminal or iTerm2, something else, or you can use another one if you have another preference. You'll need Git. If you're on Windows, just know specifically you'll need to download Git for Windows, and that information is here. The next thing is now the local development environment. The fastest way to get set up is to use XAMPP. And now what this does, it sets up your Apache web server and your MySQL database. You can go through the instructions to install XAMPP here to get it set up quickly for your local development environment. And if you haven't used this before, it sets it up under localhost dashboard, and your database can be administered through phpMyAdmin with localhost phpMyAdmin structure. Now, here are some specific settings that you'll want to update if you're on XAMPP and you're using Drupal. Just know that you'll need to increase the memory limit, and there's some other instructions here that you'll need to set up. Here's some more setting variables that need to be set, increased specifically, and so that things can work smoothly when you're setting up your local environment using XAMPP. Now, once you do that, if you're on a Windows or a Mac, there's a executable file that you can launch and start your Apache and MySQL database servers. So what you'll do if you haven't used this before is you'll click that button, the icon of the X, and you'll just start each of them to run it. Once you do that, that will set up your local server. Now, the next thing is, if you haven't used Composer, you'll need to download Composer. And what you'll need to do is, if you're using Windows, you'll need to specifically use the Windows installer. And if you're on a Mac, you can use the actual instructions on the download page for Composer. And those instructions change over time. So what they specifically change in terms of like the secret key that's being used. So then the instructions today may be different in a couple of months, but you'll need to get Composer. And what Composer is, it's just a dependency manager for PHP, and it keeps track of all the different libraries and external sources of information that you're using. The next thing is you'll need to install Drush version 9. And it specifically needs to be Drush version 9 because when you're using Drupal 8.4 and above, that's the only version that it will work with. So if you have a different version, you'll need to upgrade or downgrade. And here's the command to install Drush 9. Now, we're going to go into Emulsify. So Emulsify, what that is the design system that puts everything together. It allows you to create a Pattern Lab based and component based front end living style guide for your site that you can then connect to Drupal. And then now you have a fully functioning system that you can manage the back-end development work within Drupal and then the front end within Pattern Lab. And Emulsify is a system that ties it together. And the requirements for Emulsify are PHP 7.1 at least. And that goes back to the question that Jeff asked earlier. You'll also need Node 11, Node Version Manager. And just know that if you're using Windows, there's a specific download instruction. The next one is you'll need to use Gulp, and I'll go into each one of these briefly in the next few slides. But these are new tools that if you haven't used it before, you will need to use for this, for Emulsify. Now just, PHP version 7.1, you can check that out by looking at the PHP info file that's provided within Drupal. Or you can run this command, PHP version. Now, node 11, what node is, so what this does, it's a JavaScript runtime environment. And what that does is it executes a JavaScript code outside of the web browser. You'll need to install node version 11. And that's also very important because if you go into the website itself to download it, it's going to give you a newer version. As of this screenshot, it was asking me to download version 12, but you'll need to visit this URL to download version 11. If you don't do that, then the system won't work. The same thing with Node Version Manager. And here's Windows-specific instructions. And if you're using, let's see, yeah. So this is, yeah, for the instructions for Windows. Then the next thing you'll want to install is the Gulp. Now what Gulp does is that's the task runner. So it automates many tasks in the background. And it's actually very cool when you are using it because each time you make a change, it detects the changes made as you're developing live and it automatically updates. But one thing you'll need is Gulp version 3. And when you first install it, it's going to try to install Gulp version 4. So just look at installing Gulp 3. Now the next part is actually installing Drupal and installing it with Composer. Here's the instructions to install it with Composer and specifically with the XAMPP local development environment. One thing that's important here is the folder structure where it's actually going to be installed. So you'll have XAMPP, htdocs, and sites. And then here are the Composer commands to install the Emulsify or install Drupal on your site. Then when you do have it set up, it's going to create it at localhost sites and then your website name and then /web directory. Then you can use the web interface to complete the MySQL or the database setup. Okay, now at this point, you'll have a lot of the required software set up and you'll have Drupal 8 set up. The next thing is to install Emulsify. Now to install Emulsify, first you need to make sure you're in the correct directory. So you do present working directory. You want to make sure that you're in the sites and the name of your site directory. And here's a link that will provide you instructions to install the previous version of Emulsify. As I mentioned, it's been upgraded just a few weeks ago, but this will get you up to speed with the, and if you want to practice with the earlier version. Now, here's the commands to install Emulsify in that environment. What it does is it creates Emulsify as a theme, as a contributed theme within the themes folder in Drupal 8. And then it copies it over to a custom theme of your own naming. So the PHP, Emulsify PHP, it's going to copy it over. Then you're going to install it using npm. Now, a clean installation will have this post install script in the package JSON file, and I have it highlighted in red or outlined in red. And that works fine if you're on a Mac, but if you're on a Windows machine, those instructions don't work because the command doesn't work within PowerShell. And I work in a Windows environment, so I had to make a modification to that script to get it to work. And that's not in any instructions anywhere online. So you'll have to, so this, if you're using Windows, you'll need to use that modification. And the same thing in this Pattern Lab sh file, the instructions here on the top are the correct instructions for a Mac environment. But if you're on a Windows environment, you're going to have to change that. Now, what this has to do with is the creation of the symbolic link, because, and I'll show you later in the file structure, but what it does is it takes out the files under a particular folder, and it creates a symlink to another section that's created, and that new section is the area that you're going to want to actively be working out of. And I'm going to go over that in a second. But just know that if you're running into errors in the installation process, it could be based on this page also. And then there was another error that occurred that I had to manually change, is that when it created this style guide kit path, it did not put this vendor Pattern Lab style guide kit twig default. It automatically created a different path. So you have to change it to this path in order for it to work. And this is whether you're on a Mac or a PC. And then also, just know that if you want to look through the code, the Pattern Lab starter kit repositories are located here. And the previous version of Emulsify it references these two starter kit repositories, but one of the repositories right here, the starter kit twig demo itself from Pattern Lab, has been depreciated and has been moved to a new location. So just be aware that the demo also will not work because that has been upgraded to a newer version, but this doesn't break anything. This will still allow you to go through. But if you're wanting to investigate this a little bit more, here's the paths. The next thing is, okay, so now you have Emulsify set up. And if you did get errors in the installation process, the previous pages would have hopefully got you through those errors. Now you use npm start, and I don't know if I put the location where you're going to want to be, but you're going to want to be in the folder. So you're going to open the command line and the terminal, either through Visual Studio Code's terminal or within PowerShell or iterm2. You're going to want to change to the directory of the theme folder, the new theme folder that was created, and that's where you put npm start. What that will do is it's going to create a local host Pattern Lab public page that has a local host version for local viewing and also an external. And as you see, it's like the 192.168 and then -3000. There's one difference, is that in the external, which is a very cool feature, is that if you're on the same network, on the same internet network, it creates a server that anybody on your network can visit this URL and view what's going on in your local environment. And if you make one change in the browser on this URL, everybody is going to see the same change. So the external URL is good if you want to see how something looks on different devices, on a mobile, on tablet, on PC, all at the same time, live. So just know that these are the URLs. And then if it also creates a static Pattern Lab style guide at this URL, which is your localhost sites, the name of your site, and then web themes custom, and then what your theme name was, and then Pattern Lab public. And that's a static page that you can view whether or not npm is started or not, because npm start, the first two URLs will only work if npm is actively running, but that static page will work regardless, as long as your champ and is running. So the local development environment is working. And then your website itself will be located on localhost sites, my site name directory, and then web. And then now, let me show you what Pattern Lab, and I believe this is a video. So let me show you what it actually creates. And what it creates is a living style guide that you can then, with all the different components built in, that you will eventually need to build each component, but this is a style guide that you can show to anyone who is on the team that's making design decisions to make sure everyone agrees on what the actual components are. So this is what the style guide looks like, and I'm going to show you the video right now, but the next steps are, how do you put those pieces into Drupal so that it actually works on your website? And I think this video is not loading too, so I think this is the correct URL. So this is what Pattern Lab actually creates. Now, if you scroll down, so it creates different colors that are being used. There's different layouts, and this is the base template that you are given when you install Emulsify. If you scroll down slowly, you can see that it creates links, it creates different headings, and each of these are the components. And I'm going to show you down more, all the different pieces of a website, what images should look like, but now you go into your logo, your icons, checkbox radio select, what do buttons look like, what does a table look like, how should videos look like on your page, what do accordion items look like, and then now, so those previous ones were, the ones above were the atoms, and if you want to see the molecules, which are the arranged items, and also the organisms where the components are put together. Now this is the part, because a card is built up of the different sections, a header section, a text section, an image atom, and then a link atom. So it's built by the different pieces. And then if you have a background page, info box, menus, has a page or different status pages. And I can go down more. So now you can look at the templates and what the pages look like. So here's what the design for a header or a footer would look like. And then now here's the page component, homepage component. And what it is, it's just putting the pieces together to create that page. Now going back to the presentation.
Javier,
Yeah.
we have a question. So would you run your software as a way to test your real site software, correct? Another option, so to speak?
Is to run which software?
So you would, well, I'm reading Jeff's question.
Okay.
Yeah, so basically if you had a live site, you would, and let's say you wanted to make a change, you could run your stuff here as a test and then upload it to your existing site. And this would kind of be of a test bed to test things if you didn't run like something like Pantheon that has where you can create your own site. Just an example. Is that correct?
Yes, yes. So this here is for your local environment that you can test. And once this test is complete and it looks how you want, then you can push the code onto Pantheon or a different server environment. Because all what Emulsify is doing and Pattern Lab is creating the style guide components in the theme. So what you're really creating is just the theme, and that packages the theme folder. That theme folder is what you can upload. So, but yeah, if you're using Composer, you just have to make sure that everything, all the environments are the same so that it's not breaking when you're uploading it to the server environment. If you are using Pantheon or another service. And I've tested this on Pantheon and it works. Although Pantheon has some very specific environment variables that they include that may not work in your particular local environment instance unless you make some updates. But yes, so this is the place to make the changes to see what the theme would look like and then push those onto your server.
So one more quick question as a test, have you had good success? Because you just stated a comment that there were some issues. Are those issues kind of just random issues, or are they hard hard failure issues.
Those issues with, are you referring to the Pantheon or the
Correct.
installation issues?
No, correct, Pantheon.
No, it shouldn't be that hard of an issue, but the main issue with Pantheon is I don't remember exactly what, when you install Pantheon, so I would say the recommended way is install it with Composer on your local environment and then upload that to Pantheon versus allowing Pantheon to create its own environment, its own local environment, or its own development environment, because it's development test prod. So because when it creates its own dev, it has I think it installs like Pantheon specific modules, and there are some configuration files in the settings.php that you'll need to look at that are Pantheon specific. As long as you, and I actually have that because I made those changes myself. I don't have that code up, but this was just for the testing. As long as you copy those settings over into your local, and when you upload it, it won't have an issue.
Okay.
But just know, so those challenges aren't as hard as the installation challenges that I had mentioned previously. That's why I pointed them out. Specifically, if you're working on Windows, because those are, yeah, those could make it so that you don't want to continue with Pattern Lab because you can't get it to start in the first place. The Pantheon issue is just changing some setting variables so that it does work. So that's that. But now, let's say, so now you have Emulsify set up. In order to actually do development, you're going to want to go into this location, websites, default services, YAML, scroll down to, and you'll see a debug true and auto reload true. These are good for your testing and your local environment, and you'll want to turn it off in the production. Now, what this does, it's going to allow you to have additional features that exposes the folder structure and some of the variables in the code that you wouldn't have otherwise. In combination with setting up these development features, you're going to need to set up these modules, the development module, Kint, devel generate, and here's the instructions to set up these development modules, and I'm going to go through what it does in the following slides. Oh, the other thing is devel generate. So you're going to want to generate some test content, but this here is what a Pattern Lab Emulsify page looks like on Drupal. So it doesn't look like anything, it's just a blank site, and it has the test content already created. So this is, if you get this page, that means you have it set up, and this is how it's supposed to look when you start it up. Now, those development modules, what it does is it goes through, and if you use the debugger on Chrome or Firefox, what it does, it shows you what page is actually being used to render the content. So if you look at, for example, oh, and this is actually really important that, so this highlighted section where my mouse is, where image property, schema image, right here, if you notice the green section above, it says it's taking this content from core theme stable templates field image. So if you go into the folder structure, you'll see that this content is being called from that template file, the twig template file. And you'll notice a lot that it's taking from core themes stable. And that's important because it's using the templates from the stable theme within Drupal's pre-installed module or pre-installed theme, which is called the stable theme. So whenever you're going to do any overrides of the particular template, you're going to copy over that image.html.twig and put that particular file in your newly generated theme by Emulsify in the appropriate location, so that it then, and then you're going to have to use the theme preprocessor to change it to see that it actually uses this new theme, and then you make the changes to the copied version versus making the change directly to core theme stable. But so the important thing to know is that it's by default, a lot of the templates that are being referenced are from core theme stable, and you'll copy those over and put them into your own newly created theme from Emulsify. But just the debugger will let you know that this is where it's getting the content from. And if you scroll up a little bit more, you'll see field HTML twig with this X. That just means that that's the template file it's being taken from, but here are suggested other templates that it's getting the information from. And you can also change this later, and I think I go over that in the future slides. But for the purpose of this, the fact of having debugging just lets you know where is the content being pulled from, or where is it, what pages are being used to render that information. Now, Kint, this code here, the brackets Kint end bracket, that is what you put into your twig files. And when you put this command on your page itself, it loads something that looks like this on the right-hand side. And this is where you can scroll through and see all the different variables being output by Drupal. And here is where, because with one thing with Pattern Lab is that you're going to have to map the variable that Drupal knows as something to the variable that it's referencing within Pattern Lab. And so let's say you have an image, for example, Pattern Lab is going to, and I think I go over this in the next slides, but one thing that's important is that this piece is for the mapping of connecting what Drupal knows as the variable being displayed and connecting that to what Pattern Lab creates for that particular style. So if you have an image and you want it to look a certain way, in order to get that image in Drupal to look the way that you created in Pattern Lab, you're going to have to find what variable it is and then connect it. And you'll do that. I think I showed that after. But now I'll just show you working with Pattern Lab. So when you create Pattern Lab, I mean, when you set up Emulsify and you have Pattern Lab set up, this is what the folder structure looks like. And it's important to know how to navigate and where exactly you need to work within. So it has your site directory, your web, themes, custom, theme name. That's the top level where you're going to work on. And what I mentioned earlier is that what Emulsify does is it creates a contributed theme Emulsify and it copies over a copy of it to the custom folder, and then it creates your theme name that you generated. Now, when you open into the custom theme name, just know that you are working within components folder, patterns folder. This is where you're doing your active development. And the thing about the symbolic link I mentioned earlier in the installation process, there is another section, and I think I show it in the next slides, but what it does is it creates a symbolic link from, I think it's called Pattern Lab patterns, and then it points to this section, components patterns. So make sure when you're working in Pattern Lab and actively making design changes, it's in components patterns. And then when you're connecting the patterns to Drupal, you're using the templates folder. So yeah, so here's what more of the folder structure looks like. So under the components, you have, so the left-hand side, you have your components folder. So this is what the theme folder looks like on the very left. If you open into components, this is what it looks like here. You're going to open into patterns. And now the reason I'm showing this page is in comparison to what the Bartik theme looked like earlier in the presentation. What it does is whereas previously you had the folder structure with everything flat within that folder, and then the CSS, it was just like a general CSS. What Pattern Lab does is it now combines them into the different levels, the different components. So you have your base components, your atoms, which are the lowest level design elements, and then the combined elements into molecules, organisms, templates, pages. But if you open up atoms, you'll see now everything is structured through the folder structure into the different pieces. And if you go into buttons specifically, now you'll have your button twig file, your YAML file, Markdown, and your SAS, SCSS. Whereas before in the Bartik Drupal 8, your CSS file was in a separate folder, but now each specific component that's being developed has its own twig file, has its own SAS file. And those two are the most important things. The YAML is also important. So it's just the three, the SCSS file, the twig file, and then the YAML file. Those are the most important if you're creating a new component. So that's something that you'll need to look at when you're, and these are the actual pieces that you're modifying when you're working in the code. So that's that. And then if I go into the next slide, this is what it actually looks like when you're developing. So on the top right, you have the style. You're working within the twig file. And this here is specifically the code for the button. And then the YAML file, what this does, this is providing the data that is going to be presented within the Pattern Lab generated style guide. It's not what's connected to Drupal. What's connected to Drupal is going to be done in the twig file. And that's where I was saying all the variables being exposed in Kint. This particular twig file doesn't have much, but there's going to be a value pair or key and value pair that you're going to need to connect the variable of what Drupal knows as a piece of content and then connect that to this particular, what the actual style that's being created within Pattern Lab. And I do think I get into that a little bit more when I go to the next slides.
Just really quick, Javier. So we're really kind of at time, but anyway, I don't want to stop you. I just wanted to let you know that I didn't know if other people had questions.
Okay.
But
yeah,
just so you know.
All right, thank you. And also just, I'm almost at the end of the presentation. I think there's just a few more slides. Yeah, it's a few more slides, but thank you for letting me know. Now, one thing that's important is that when you're developing in this new Pattern Lab, you're going to use something called block element modifier syntax. This is some resources if you want to learn how to do it, but essentially, let's say you have a card. It's pretty much attaching the names to the CSS. So now you have card images or card image, and then is it card image large? It's just a syntax for adding different class names, but you'll have to understand how it works. And this is where you can learn more about it. And then what's also new is that it's using SAS, the preprocessor for CSS, so you're not developing in CSS directly, you're now developing in SAS. And then the folder structure for, so here is where you are developing the templates. So, okay, this is the actual piece where you're connecting Pattern Lab, what you create in Pattern Lab into Drupal. So you're going to go into this templates folder and you're going to go into the form. And as I mentioned earlier, that it pulls from the core stable theme. So what you're going to do is copy any core stable theme, twig files, template files, and paste that into here. So this specific folder structure, the templates, and then the specific, and you'll notice the block content dataset fields form. This middle level corresponds to what's in the stable theme. So it's almost a mirror of the stable theme. So what you're going to do is you're going to copy it over. And then this is the actual, on the right-hand side, those are the twig files that you're going to be modifying. And that's what you're going to be doing to connect what was created in Pattern Lab and connect that to Drupal. And here is just some pages of doing that. So as you notice, here is the section that I was talking about. Heading here, so line 42 on the left, label is the corresponding Drupal variable that's being used. And you'll notice that when you start getting into more development, as you progress further and further along, that's where it's going to become apparent. And if I continue going through the pages, here's some twig functions. One thing you'll know is that there's include, extend, and embed. The include and embed are used the most. Extend is almost never used. Here's some resources you can do when you're developing twig functions. And let me go back to the page to see if I can see it. Yeah, on the right-hand side, as you can see, it says embed molecules card twig. So that's where embed is being used. So if you want to learn more about the twig functions, you can go here, but include and embed are what's being used the most. And here is that folder structure that I mentioned, your web core theme, stable, templates. You're going to copy it over from the core stable theme, and you're going to put it into this templates folder. Now, that is the end of the presentation. If you're going to be working on setting up your own Pattern Lab SAL guide with Emulsify, these are references on the left-hand side were very important. Well, pretty much all of these were important, but the left-hand side ones are pretty much, you're going to want to go through all of these to get started. If you want some inspiration for sites that are built with this exact system, you'll see there's Ithaca College, UC Davis, and Massachusetts government. The Massachusetts and UC Davis provide some of their code available and their templates. So you can use that as inspiration. And then on the top left, here are some more instructions. And as I mentioned, what I'm showing you here is as of current as of 3 weeks ago. So 3 weeks ago, the whole system upgraded. And if you're gonna, and it now uses Storybook, Webpack, and Gatsby. So if you want to get this set up as a test, maybe do it through Pattern Lab, what I just explained in this presentation, or you can go directly into installing the newer version. But just know that some of those issues that I experienced in terms of things that needed to be changed in the installation may also be present in this new version. Here is the on the left-hand side are some links for the upgrading. If you use the older version, which is the one that's explained here, there's an upgrade path, and you'll just have to follow this upgrade path to get the newer version. I am currently in the process of upgrading, so I'm still learning what is necessary to upgrade an older version to this newer version. And yeah, thank you for attending. You can see this presentation at this link on the Sanford webcam page. And if you have any other additional questions, I'm happy to answer. Or yeah, otherwise, thank you for attending this, and hope you all have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, Javier. That was great. I can leave this room open if you guys want to stay and talk more. If you don't, and I can just, the recording will still go on, and you guys can ask questions if you'd like. It's totally up to you.
Thank you. See how many are still on. So it looks like there's a few people still on. So if either Jeff or Michael have a question, if not, then we can end it also. But
Jeff looks like he has a
Yeah,
question.
I'm actually really interested in this. I'll be honest. It was very good.
thank you.
First of all, the recommendation obviously is probably you're better off doing this on a Macintosh than you are a Windows box. Is that correct?
Yeah, unless, for example, your work environment requires that you use a Windows, then yeah. Then
No,
the
we're
Mac-
Stanford, so we use right. And then one question for Claire: how soon can I get the slides on these? I mean, I know we got to wait. I mean, I'm really interested in trying to set this up, but obviously in a half hour, you can.
The slides are available today. They're on the webcam page. Let me.
Oh, they are. Okay.
Let me just go a little quickly. Yeah, they should. The slide should be there, and if not, we can put them up.
Yeah. So if you
It's just it's just the video that. Yeah, there you go.
Okay.
It's just the video that's going to take a little while.
Okay. Fair enough. Perfect.
So if you go to this one and then you scroll down to the bottom, the slides are available.
Wonderful. Great. This looks really good. I'm going to try it for the record.
Okay, perfect. And yeah, feel free to email me if you have any questions. But as I said, the new Emulsify has already been released. So if you follow the instructions I did, that's going to give you the older version as of 3 weeks ago, which is what a lot of systems are currently built on. And but future proofing it, you're going to want to do the newer version, which uses Storybook, but the documentation has instructions on how to do the upgrade.
Let me ask you real quick, the older version, obviously it's probably more stable. Obviously when you do new versions, you always run into issues. So would your recommendation be to just stay with the old version and wait a while till putting the new version on?
Personally, for a project I'm working on, I'm going to the new version before releasing it to production. But the older version should still work just fine. Oh, you know what is different? So if you are using the newer version, the folder structure changed slightly. So what is on this page, for example, you see the atoms, the links text, list, image, forms, buttons.
Right.
In the newer version, if you open into one of the buttons, for example, how it has 0, 1 button twig, in the newer version, that may have changed to underscore button twig. So it's going to break. So you'll have to match the specific links over. And I actually think maybe if you're wanting to test it out just for practice, maybe do the older version to see if you can get it going.
Right.
But I would probably use the newer version. And the reason for the newer version is that they're using technology, and the methodology, the rationale for moving to the newer version is that Storybook, Webpack, and Gatsby are all very popular and well documented software that has their own communities and are thriving communities, so that what Emulsify is doing is that they're using they're converting to different ecosystems that are very well maintained and have a lot of support for, compared to what was available in the older version. So if you need support, you may get more support in the general development community by using the newer version, because it's based on technology that is being used widely outside of Drupal.
So my question for then Claire is that, do those 3 items there, Claire, is Earth using any of that, or if you were going to do this, would you just do the old version?
Oh, well, so I don't get to do the back end stuff. That would be a question for Aaron or Cassie.
Okay.
Or you could probably ask somebody in web services because it's all in Pantheon. And so, but we're trying to configure a lot of our local environments, and they're having a lot of issues with that in general. So I would just talk to Aaron if you can, Slack him or something. And then like John, Shay has been helping us, Dina DeBry. So Dina DeBry is our project manager, but she's also a developer. Anyway, so if you want their, so.
Might be good. Okay.
Yeah.
This looks really good though.
Yeah,
This was really, really good. I'm just it's going to take some work. So I think I'm gonna have to go through the slides to set this up. And obviously I'm on a Mac. Well, I'm on a Mac for the record. So it should be interested. So maybe I'll keep your email if I have anything.
Right, thank you. Yeah, the important thing is to know which folder, how the folder structure works. And you'll want to look at this to know how to modify Twig and then how to connect Twig. But if you look at these resources too, I relied heavily on these resources when I was learning how to do this. But yeah, try it with the old version. And as I said, the only issue is going to be related to, well, one of the issues is going to be, okay, how do you now set up Storybook? How do you set up Webpack? How do you use Gatsby? That's a separate issue in itself. But the issue of the upgrade is that the paths are changed. So it's not going to be a direct upgrade. You're going to have to figure out what you created in the old version and then map that, copy it over to the newer version.
Okay. And then just one more question for you. How long did it take you originally to set this up on your computer when you did this?
Oh, well, okay. These issues here, there was almost no documentation for anywhere on the internet that I could find because I was using a Windows machine. So not many people are using it that I was able to find. But these 3 errors took a really long time. But now that everything is laid out for you, as long as you have if you don't have these environments set up, but if you already do, it's going to take, I would just say, give yourself a week safely to do it and to overcome any potential issues with, if you're using a Mac, there are issues with, you need to go into the folder structure, and I don't remember exactly where it is, but it's like a global environment variables, because I did this both on Windows and Mac.
Wow.
When I was testing out Pattern Lab.
Press.
Mac, I was able to do it probably, let's say a day, for example, versus it took a much longer to do on the Windows machine because of all the errors. But there were also, the errors you're going to counter on your Mac are related to, do you have the right version of PHP? Do you have the right version of Gulp? Are you able to download the right version of Node to get it to work? Because if you don't have this combination for the older version, it's not going to work and you're going to get errors. So that's where the challenges are, just making sure you have the correct versions. And but the steps are laid out so that you can do it very fast. But just to be safe, give it a couple of days.
Well, very good. Thank you. You did a great job.
Thanks, Javier. That was great. I don't even do this stuff, and I was like, oh, I think with these instructions, I might actually be able to follow along.
Yeah, and that was the goal, to get to literally lay everything out. So if you're brand new, you can just follow it. And the challenges of installation and getting everything set up are meant to be, or the benefits that you get from using Pattern Lab and a style guide that the whole organization can use and rely on and agree upon. Those benefits of making a change in one place. So if you were to change one atom and now it's applied everywhere on all pages. And I think that may have been the benefits I may have needed to explain a little bit more, but when you want to make a change to what the button looks like, you make it in Pattern Lab, you connect it to Drupal, and then everywhere on your website, that button is changed. So that's where the benefit is. So the initial installation process that you need to overcome and learning how to do it is supposed to be outweighed by the benefits of faster development that can then be used organization-wide in the future.
Thank you.
All right, thank you all. Yeah, hope you all have a great rest of the day. And
One more thing.
oh, okay.
What's name? Michael had a good question. Can you answer Michael's question while I'm online?
Oh, the one about Pattern Lab?
Yes.
I can't answer that question.
Where's the question?
Question is, doesn't Stanford have a Pattern Lab installation base? And I
Oh.
honestly don't know.
Yeah, so I have that. I think I even have the link here in the resources. Decanter.
Oh, is that
Stanford.
Decanter?
Oh, is that Cantor?
Cantor?
this-
Oh,
Can I see that
okay.
again? Okay.
Yeah, so that's one of the resources I looked at when
Oh,
I
okay,
was
great.
looking at Pattern. So
Oh yeah, and
Decanter-
Decanter is new, but they've been starting to use it for the Drupal 8 sites platform. That's like the base theme for that. So
Yeah, so they have different elements built out. So the colors, icons.
cool, great.
All right, well, thank you guys, and hope you have a
Okay.
great rest
Thanks
of
a
the
lot.
day. And yeah, good luck setting this up if you're going to set it up.
am.
And as you know, as I mentioned, just the technology is changing very fast. So the newer version is, I'm sure they're going to have a lot of changes, because even if you look at the documentation for the newer version, it still says coming soon. So
Great.
it's not available yet.
Okay,
Good job, Claire. You did a good job. Thank you.
Yeah, Javier did a good job.
Oh, yeah.
Everybody did. Everybody did. Thanks.
Thanks, guys.
All right.
Have
Take
a great
care.
rest of the day.
You
All
too.
right.
Thanks.